Trouble magazine would like to thank its sponsors: Ararat Gallery Tama, Bendigo Living Art Space, Fox Galleries Melbourne, Manningham Gallery, Swan Hill Regional Art Gallery, Wangaratta Art Gallery and Western Sydney University. Thanks for your support.
What if a conversation could change your mind about yourself and about the world? What if a conversation could one day lead to a change in government policy? I'm Dr. Mark Halloran, and you're listening to Deep Trouble.
We're back in the studios of Main FM, 94.9 Main FM, and once again, I am facing down Mark Halloran.
Hi, Steve.
We've got a very interesting interview today. Why are they all so interesting, Mark?
Because I think we choose really, really good subjects.
I think you choose very good subjects. And tonight, you'll be interviewing Professor Jenny Graves.
Yeah, so Professor Jenny Graves is from La Trobe University. She's a world-renowned geneticist who was made famous or infamous for her postulation that the Y chromosome is disappearing and has recently written articles for The Conversation discussing the evolution of the gay gene and the genetics of transgenderism.
Do you think there are any ethical implications in her research?
Well, there's always ethical implications in terms of scientists' research, particularly for geneticists. I don't think there's any manipulation going on, though. Simply, you're looking at whether the gene is present or not present. So it doesn't have the same ethical connotations as something like creating a genetically modified organism or something like that, where there are lots of ethical questions that come up. I think what is interesting about this is there are two narratives around this in terms of social constructionism versus biology, essentially. And the biological determinants are fairly clear. And interestingly, if you're talking about somebody's sexuality, like someone being homosexual, the idea that this is socially constructed, the view that this is determined by cultural or social learning or something like that, has been well and truly in decline since the 1950s, since anthropologists from the 1950s. It's also the idea that it's socially constructed. Interestingly enough, in the 80s and 90s and probably earlier than that, it was really the Christian right that didn't want to look at any kind of genetic determinism, because their argument, as Jenny points out, is that if it's genetics, well then how could have God created somebody with a gene that makes them transgender or gay? And so they simply don't want to accept it, because they don't want to accept the idea that God would create
fallible.
That God would create somebody who is gay or transgender. And
there is biblical refutation in tonight's interview in part, because, we're talking about creative design. What do you call that? Intelligent design?
So, yeah, Jenny used to run a website which is called Dumb Design, and she used to use certain examples from the animal kingdom, like the spotted hyena. So in terms of the way that the spotted hyena is evolved, she uses that as an example to say that, well, there is no intelligent creator, because if you're an intelligent creator, you wouldn't create this. This is a collection of mutations gone awry, essentially, that have selected themselves out and are now sort of functional.
I think our listeners will find it's a fascinating interview. So without further ado, let's have a listen to Mark Halloran in conversation with Professor Jenny Graves.
I wanted to talk to you first about your work in terms of sex determination. You've become famous or infamous for your contention that the Y chromosome is disappearing.
Yes, indeed, and it is disappearing too, but very slowly. So the work we did on kangaroos and platypus told us that our sex chromosomes were just ordinary chromosomes about 166 million years ago. And we know how many genes are on them now, how many genes were on them then, and we can calculate that over that period of 166 million years, they've lost about 10 genes per million years. There's only 45 left, So it's not very hard to calculate that in 4.5 million years, our Y chromosome is likely to be gone.
So what will that mean for the Y chromosome?
Well, you might not even notice it because it's actually happened in a couple of species of rodents. They have lost their Y chromosome, but another gene has come up to take over the job of the sex-determining gene, and another chromosome is on the way to becoming a Y chromosome.
Then if the Y chromosome disappears and that region remains, does that mean that you have infertile males?
We'd love to know how it's likely to happen. We know that on the balance of probabilities, it will happen in the next 4.5 million years, that is, if human beings last that long, which seems quite unlikely. Probably what will happen, either the Y will disappear and will become extinct, because we do need males and we do need sperm. We can't do parthenogenesis like some lizards do. That won't work because there's a lot of genes that have to come through the sperm. They're called imprinter genes, and they're not active unless they come through sperm. So we do need men and we do need sperm, but those sperm genes can also bounce onto other chromosomes, and that's what has happened in some of these rodents that have lacked the Y chromosome. The sperm genes have got stuck onto other chromosomes, or copies of those sperm genes have got stuck on other chromosomes, or other similar genes have taken over the function.
So I wanted to talk to you about this in relation to the article that you've written for The Conversation recently in regards to transgender and the genetics of transgenderism.
I've been interested in transgender for quite a long time. The reason was I got involved in looking for the sex-determining gene quite by accident back in the late 1980s, when we thought the gene called ZFY was a sex-determining gene. And we're starting to do some work on, is there a ZFY in marsupials? And the long and short of it is, yes, there is, but it's not on the Y chromosome. That's actually the wrong gene. And my student Andrew Sinclair then went to London and cloned the right gene. But at that time, a psychiatrist called Dr. Bowers came to my lab. He'd been working with transsexuals for a long, long time. He was a psychiatrist, and he was one of the few people who would sanction sex change operations. So he was regarded as a big hero in the transsexual community. Yeah. And he was quite sure that there was something genetic about transsexualism, because he observed that a lot of the people he saw had always believed they were the other sex, right, even when they were small children. And he wanted me to look at the ZFY gene and see if there was some sort of mutation in that gene. Well, to begin with, of course, it was the wrong gene. There's a number of different, what they call disorders of sex determination. They call them DSD patients, and there are a lot of different ways in which sex doesn't develop properly. There's something like 30 genes that are involved in either making a testis or an ovary in the embryo. And if something is wrong with any of those genes, you'll often get sex change. So there's a whole lot of DSDs, and a lot of them that we can't explain yet. There's probably more genes that we don't yet know about in that pathway.
But certainly it's what's occurring is that the embryo and fetus, at some points in development, something happens, and therefore it moves from whether it was being masculinized in a phenotypic way.
Yes.
Not talking about social or cultural, and then moves back to its being a female phenotype.
And a lot of these people have no idea there's anything amiss. For instance, there's a gene that you've referred to before that is a receptor of androgens.
Yes.
And now if that gene, which is on the X chromosome, if that gene is mutated, you get a perfectly normal looking female. And she doesn't realise that she's actually got a Y chromosome and a perfectly good SRY gene, yes, until she fails to menstruate. Several have been models or champion tennis players, right, because they're bigger and stronger and very beautiful. But they have a Y chromosome and an SRY gene, and the SRY gene made testes and the testes made androgens, but their body can't use the androgens because they have no androgen receptor. So that's a very late stage in the pathway, but if you interrupt that stage, you interrupt everything.
Essentially, in terms of intersex development, there is a continuum of, let's say, intersex, for want of a better word, conditions.
Yes, I don't like the term intersex because it's not really inter anything.
What term do you prefer?
Well, I think DSD, disorders of sex determination, it's a blanket term that means just anything that is awry with sex determination.
Right. Maybe the intersex term is the one used by people within the community.
Oh, I think that's probably true in their books called intersex, but it's a term that doesn't really convey. I mean, these are very specific disorders, and we know a great deal about a lot of them.
I'm going to talk about a couple of them.
Sure.
A couple of cross-cultural examples. I think sometimes from an anthropological perspective, maybe anthropologists have confused, because transgender populations have existed across time and culture, intersex populations across the world. I mean, one is in the Dominican Republic, a village Salinas, where 1 in every 90 boys are born female and then convert.
That's the same as the Tiwi Islands. It's very, very common.
Yes.
And we know a lot about that condition.
And
they call them make-em-man.
Well, there's a tribe in Papua New Guinea, the Sambia tribe, which is the Kowalu Atamwal. I'm sure I didn't say that properly, but it means, or changing into male thing. But in Pidgin English, and I went there, it's the turn of men. Can you talk about why that occurs?
I'm no biochemist, so I can't ever remember the name of all the enzymes in the pathway, but there is a particular enzyme that is involved in making androgens, and it doesn't work as well as its normal counterpart. So that's why these people are born looking like females, but at puberty there's a rush of androgens, and enough androgens to convert the clitoris to a penis and make a man.
The difference between gender and sex, because this is a pretty important, I mean, socially, this is an issue which has become of paramount importance. It's being discussed a lot.
Absolutely.
We've got intellectuals, I guess, talking about this to some extent. We've got people like Jordan Peterson in Canada talking about pronouns. I wonder what your thoughts about the whole social situation is.
Well, I've thought about this over many, many years, because people for a long time will ask me things about gender, and they'll really mean sex, because I work on sex. I don't work on gender. It seems to me that sex is a product of essentially your genes, and it is who you are biologically, but gender is who you think you are, who you identify with. They can be concordant, and in most people, gender and sex are concordant, but in a very significant minority of people, it's not concordant.
What I took away from your work, or your comments on some of the work that's come out of Monash University, is both the concordance and the inconcordance is biologically based.
I think there's got to be some biological basis for it, because people have done twin studies. They're not huge twin studies, but they all point to some component, genetic component. And what they do is look at identical twins who have identical genes and compare the concordance, that is both cisgender or both transgender, compare that with the general population, and they find a very significant, not huge, I think it's 30% or something like that, concordance. I'll bet you it's actually more than that, because of course we know that there are a lot of transgender people who don't want to come out, and so I would expect that as it becomes more acceptable to be transgender, that frequency will probably rise. We know that there's social factors as well to play, and twin studies are usually the way you measure how much is genetic and how much is social, and 30% is what they generally find, which is a considerable, not overwhelming, and I'll bet it's actually quite a bit bigger than that, but it's possible now to look at particular genes and find out if variants of those genes are more common in the transgender populations. And there have been 2 or 3 studies, quite small studies, that have said, yes, this gene, this variant of the gene is more common in transgender people. The latest one was done by my colleague Vince Harley at the Hudson Institute, and he looked at 12 genes that are all known to have something to do with hormones. And 4 of those genes had variants which were quite uncommon in the general population and much more common in the transgender population. And all of these genes would have something to do with hormone levels. So that seemed to make sense. I would bet you that if you do a full genome screen, you might well find hundreds of genes that have something to do with gender identity. Just that, if you look at 12, you're only going to find out something about 12. We've got another 20,000 or so. People are now looking at not just 12 genes, but all genes, and comparing them in the transgender and the cisgender population. And that's just mutations. So you're just looking at DNA. It's now possible to look at the expression of these genes too, and also the epigenetic modifications of all the genes in the genome. And who knows what we're going to get out of that. My guess is that it won't be just 1 or 2, 3, 4 genes. It might be hundreds of genes that add together to give people their sense of gender. As I think that's probably the case for homosexuality too. I mean, mate choice is a highly selectable thing, and we know that just in fruit flies there are lots and lots of genes that contribute to mate choice. They're genes that, if they're mutation, males will mate with males. So there'll be lots and lots of genes, and I expect there'll be lots and lots of genes that contribute to your sense of gender.
Does it then become difficult? Because I'm thinking about sexuality and at least your gender identity as being pretty complex behaviours.
The analogy I like to make is on height. I mean, height varies enormously in any population, and on average, males are 14 centimetres taller than females. But within both males and females, there's a great spread, and it's not at all unusual to have a short male or a tall female. So I would expect gender identity to be much the same. There will be, in both males and females, a spectrum, a whole distribution from very female to very male. And of
typical,
course,
you mean, in terms of
absolutely,
on average?
Typically, that's what I would expect. If there are lots of genes that contribute to gender identity, and they're not all linked, or none of them are linked to actual biological sex, you would expect to find feminine guys and masculine women. That's what you see.
You're listening to Deep Trouble. Dr. Mark Halloran in conversation with Jenny Graves, Professor of Genetics.
Because essentially what it comes down to, this is the crux, I suppose, for me, is that your work is around some sort of biological basis, genetic biological basis. But the zeitgeist for the time at the moment would be one which probably had more influence in the 1950s from anthropology, from people like Franz Boas and Margaret Mead, which is social constructionism. So people talk about, well, gender's just a construct. So it's just that we make it up. So if the reason I'm male is because people taught me to be male. And this is an idea that's taken on. And I can understand why it's taken on, because it kind of explains to people why you would be, born, with male phenotype, but then feel as though your whole life you've been a woman. But the interesting thing was that it was exactly that ideology that really affected the DSD population, because what these people did was they came in and said, well, look, gender's only a social construct, so it doesn't matter if they've got ambiguous genitalia, just pick the one that looks the most likely and surgically remove the rest and raise the person as a girl or a boy or whatever else, and they'll be fine. Of course they weren't, because there was something biological about their identity. Well,
of course, there's a huge cultural emphasis on gender, and there's huge arguments about how much is socially constructed. I'm a mother. I'm now a grandmother. I have grandson, granddaughters, and nobody can tell me that there's no biological differences. They are so different. And I think most parents would recognise that even if they try to bring up their little girls to play with trucks, they will play with dolls, and their little boys will play with guns, even if you give them dolls for Christmas. There are things that every parent notices, and they're much deeper than cultural constructs. Given that, though, of course, there are huge cultural pressures to conform to one sex or the other. I mean, my hope is that one day it'll actually cease to matter. If men and women were really equal in the eyes of the law and society, then what does it matter what you are? We are not in that happy place yet, though it does matter. There are all kinds of pressures to make little girls into princesses and little boys into heroes. And I would love to see those cultural pressures cease, but I can't see that happening anytime soon.
It's not as though these ideas like gender are not to some extent culturally constructed.
I think it's interesting to admit that, of course, there's huge social pressures to conform one way or the other, but probably people are genetically more or less susceptible to them. Right. So little boys who have more of the feminizing genes are much more likely to rebel against being given a gun for Christmas and going to shoot ducks or something. And I think that's the way that these other genes are expressed, is to make children much less susceptible to social pressures to be a certain sex. If they have very strong feminizing genes, they're not going to put up with that. If a girl has very strong masculinizing genes, she's not going to be put up with being told that she's a princess and has to wear wings.
I guess you've also talked about, was it the work of Dean Hamer?
Dean Hamer, yes.
Hamer,
he was who's somebody I met many years ago. So he published in, I think it was 1998, the first really good study looking specifically for gay genes.
Yes.
There'd been speculation, how much of this was genetic and how much was environmental for years and years. And of course, it all gets very religious and all caught up in all kinds of stuff.
So he I watched the video and he talked about the right-wing conservative politics, probably in America, really affecting the idea that they really didn't want a biological basis.
Well, I didn't ever really understand that until somebody in America told me, look, you don't understand. If there are gay genes, that means God made a sinner, and God can't make a sinner, so therefore there can't be genes. What? That was the logic behind it. And so very strong it was. So Dean Hamer came out with a study that I looked through with great interest, and I thought it was an excellent study. I mean, the problem with homosexuality, at least in 1998, was that there are lots of gay people who don't want to come out. And so doing twin studies and that sort of thing, you're always going to underestimate the frequency of homosexuality and the concordance in twins. Because people don't want to admit they're gay. It's like a self-report, essentially. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So obviously a lot of people were not out of the closet and didn't want to come out. So that was a problem. So he looked specifically at brothers who were both out and gay. Right. And so he did not have that problem. And he looked specifically for families in which gay brothers had gay male relatives on the mother's side.
Right.
Now, that may seem strange to you, but that's looking specifically for genes on the X chromosome that are inherited by males only from their mothers.
Yes.
So I thought that was a very smart thing to do, because he was boiling it down to a smaller number of people, but looking very specifically for something on the X chromosome. And what he did was compare all the genes up and down the X chromosome and look for what parts of the X both brothers had inherited. Right. And that pointed to a particular region on the bottom of the X chromosome, which has now been substantiated 3 separate times. Right. And said, yes, well, there's at least one gay gene here.
Right.
And we still don't know what it is.
Right.
But there certainly is one there, and there's probably several others that people have used the same kinds of methods to identify. Yeah. I'm saying there's probably hundreds.
You've talked about, I think you wrote about the Human Genome Project identifying at least 3 or 4 more, chromosome 8.
Well, there are similar studies to Dean Hamer's, and there was a lot of controversy about that, but I think there's no question that there are at least 3 or 4 well-substantiated gay genes there. What I've said is I don't believe they're gay genes. Right. What I think they are is male-loving
Yes,
genes.
I did want to ask you about that. Or female-loving could be potentially...
Well, I mean, the mystery to me is not that there are male-loving genes, because selection will mate choice is one of the hottest selectable traits there are in fruit flies, humans and everything else. So it's absolutely not surprising if they're male-loving genes. But they'll be selected for in females. Right. So females that have male-loving genes are likely to partner early and have more kids.
This is an Italian study, isn't it?
And in fact they do. There's Italian studies that say they have a lot more kids.
1.3 more children
That's
than
right.
Than
I mean, it's astonishing.
Females.
And the reason I wrote that article in the conversation was that this was really not known in the gay community. Right. And I thought, well, that's terribly important to know these are not gay genes, they're male-loving genes, and they're very common. because they're selected for in the female relatives of gay men.
Yes.
So if gay men don't have as many children, it doesn't matter because their sisters and aunts do have more children. So the gay genes keep on being pretty high frequency in the population.
How do they know that those regions, so if you take Hamer's work with the X chromosome across twins, how do they know that that region really is influencing really complicated behaviour?
Well, what they looked
It's
at
commonality.
was simply commonality.
Yeah.
These two brothers, which bits of the X chromosome do they have in common?
Yes.
Because every generation, because in their mother, she has two X chromosomes, they swap bits, so, one brother gets one bit and the other brother
Yes.
gets a different bit.
Yeah.
So what bit of the X do they all have in common? And I think he had something like 23 pairs of gay brothers. So he was looking across a number, and it all pointed to this particular region on the X chromosome, and other studies have come up with the same region and others. And I'm saying it would be really surprising if there weren't lots and lots of male-loving genes.
Well, I suppose the question would be that it's not as though, is it that it would be a single gene? So if it was in these particular cases, because it could vary for individuals, essentially, across hereditary and family, but could it be that it's not just that gene, even in one individual, and it's multiple genes?
I mean, evolution doesn't care what gene it is. If it makes you mate earlier and have more children,
yes,
evolution is onto it.
Yes.
So any gene that has a variant that makes you partner early and have more children will be selected for. And that's why I'm saying it would be really surprising if there weren't lots and lots of male-loving genes. And I'll bet you there are lots and lots of female-loving genes and male-loving genes.
Yes. And that's why that was essentially how you tried to answer, I think, was it in terms of evolutionary fitness hypothesis?
Exactly.
So you would have said to the question would have been, well, if a person's gay, they might be less likely to have children, and so less likely to pass on genes.
So that's always been the problem. Why is homosexuality so common? Because you can argue about how common it is, but it is really common.
Yep.
And to me, that really didn't make sense in terms of the genes being passed from gay men because they on average have fewer children. But if the same gene is in their sisters and their aunts and they have more children, that will make up for it. And I'm making the same sort of prediction for transgender genes.
Yes.
I think any gene that makes you feel more feminine is likely to give you trans women who don't have as many children, but the sisters and aunts are likely to partner early and have more children because they feel more feminine, and that's going to give you a higher frequency of those genes. It's what we call sexual antagonism, which is a really funny term. But
is someone going to do that study? Is someone doing the study in terms of transgender people?
I've been contacted by at least 3 people who are interested in doing that study.
You're listening to Deep Trouble. Dr. Mark Halloran in conversation with Jenny Graves, Professor of Genetics.
There's now a continuum in terms of gender within the trans community. So you've got people identify, I don't know all of the identification, but non-binary. So there's people saying, I don't identify with either. What would be your explanation there in terms of genetically?
Well, I think if it's like height and you have men who are short and men who are tall, and most people somewhere in the middle, if gender identity is the same, you have men who are very masculine, men who are very feminine, most people somewhere in the middle.
Yes.
And you expect to have a decline in the number of people who very strongly want to be female, or who not so strongly want to be female, quite happy to dress up a bit, but aren't, are generally fairly happy living as a man as long as they can express their feminine side in some way or another.
Yes.
To the middle of the road where most people are going to be, to the other extreme where you have very gung-ho masculine males.
Yes. I suppose I wonder, thinking about it now, that the same thing with sexuality. So you might have people who are maybe genetically combined with culture and environment, very, very heterosexual, and then people who are very, very homosexual.
Absolutely.
But maybe because some of the environmental constraints are being removed, like societal constraints, so we're changing the way that we behave as a society and some of our societal norms, there are more people sort of moving towards the middle.
Oh, I'm sure. Well,
because are there more people in the middle?
I think there's always more people in the middle when you have any kind of spread with many genes involved, like height.
Like
most
a bell
people will be
curve.
a bell curve, if you like. So it's the people on either side who can run into trouble because their feeling about themselves is not coordinate with their biology. I would expect as we become more accepting, and hopefully we are becoming more accepting,
Yes.
we'll find more and more people coming out as trans or wanting to express their feminine side more openly. And one hopes that that's exactly what's happening now.
Because I feel like there is some resistance to your research as well. In the articles that I've read, I think Sally Goldner from Transgender Victoria, they were very concerned about the study at Monash University because they didn't want they didn't think it was such a bad idea that you could find some biological determinants, but this was sort of the same thing with the Hamer.
Yeah, absolutely.
With the people didn't want to necessarily, they were concerned about being reduced to biological elements and genetics.
Well, I think
because
they were
felt
practically concerned with the idea that that parents could test their embryos and reject those that had gay genes.
Like a test, essentially.
Exactly.
Yep.
And I think those were very real concerns.
Yes.
And what I'm hoping is there'll be so many genes involved that it'll be impossible to test and predict.
Yes.
And I'm sure that is what's happening with homosexuality. There's going to be a lot of genes there. It really is not going to be possible to make a predictive test.
Yes.
And so hopefully that just isn't going to happen.
Because I suppose I feel like the part of the concern was also that if people are tested, let's say you're a man who identifies as a woman, but you don't show up the right genes and things like that, then where do you fall? Whereas the social constructed idea is kind of all encompassing.
I got some very interesting comments back on my transgender article, which I think you haven't read yet.
Yes.
And one person was making the point that it would be useful to have a predictive test because, for instance, if you had a child who was expressing transgenderism, now we know that half those children are going to change their mind and become cisgender on puberty.
It was about 80%, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot. And you don't want to obviously do drastic surgery on somebody who's then going to change their mind because that's horrible for everybody.
That's a natural part of child development as
Oh,
well.
absolutely.
Like having some of what they'd call now fluidity in terms of gender. In terms of identity is a very natural thing for children to do.
Oh, I think so. And I think one wants to encourage girls to climb trees and boys to like art. That we'd like to have children who had the full range of experiences. But it's obviously important to know which kids are not going to change their mind and passionately want to be the other sex.
Yes.
And if there were, this commenter said, if there were a predictive test, you would know which kids are really going to want to change sex. Now, that's kind of in opposition to the, if it were possible to do a predictive test, then maybe there would be embryo selection or terminations,
right,
which I think nobody wants.
Yeah.
So I can see that
there's
a concern. I can see there might be valid reasons for wanting a predictive test, but to me the dangers far outweigh the benefit.
Yes. Because they're concerned about things like neo-eugenics.
Oh, absolutely.
Which is always a concern.
Yes,
like even in the development of tests for developmental disorders. So as you expand, so we have tests for Down syndrome, and as you expand that, they want to expand more tests out to pick up more developmental disorders. But some people have looked at that and said, well, the rate of then voluntary selective abortion for people for embryos with Down syndrome is it's 80% in France or something like that. So it's actually a form of neo-eugenics.
Well, of course, I'm very familiar with those arguments, and I would have to say from my knowledge of people who have had babies with severe congenital defects, I would certainly go for genetic testing on all serious developmental effects and
Yes.
selective abortion.
Yes.
But I know people who chose to carry a baby to term even though they knew it would have no brain.
Yes.
Now, to me, I can't understand how you could possibly do that.
So that's anencephaly or something.
Yeah,
like.
anencephaly.
Yeah.
That's, to me, so horrible I can't even think about it. But,
Right.
you know, in terms of Down syndrome, I know people also who have had a Down diagnosis and chosen to continue their pregnancy and who love their Down's
Yes.
child. I mean, Down's
Yes.
children are very lovable.
Yes.
So there's no line.
No, well, I
there.
suppose it's it's labelled that, but it's simply an ethical question.
Yes.
So it raises interesting.
I don't think anybody would want selective abortion against embryos who were not going to be good tennis players, for instance. That's getting into the designer baby thing, and
Yeah.
I think very few people would support that. And then on the other side, there are horrible, horrible syndromes that you would not wish a baby to live for 3 years with any of these horrible syndromes. But in that huge area, there are people who will opt for one or the other solution.
You're listening to Deep Trouble. Dr. Mark Haller in conversation with Jenny Graves, Professor of Genetics.
I wanted to talk about your animal work and talk about some of the interesting cases because I think it still relates to gender and sexuality to some extent. Tell me about some of the interesting cases in terms of animals, because I read a bit of your paper in terms of the way that we've got chromosomes that genetically select the X and Y chromosome, but there are animals that do it through temperature, through environmental cues.
Well, most of my life I've been working on the chromosomes that determine sex.
Yes.
And of course, in humans, it's the Y chromosome and the SRY gene. Quite accidentally, when I first came back from the United States, where I did my PhD, came back to La Trobe University, I started working on kangaroos. And the reason for that was a friend of mine said, "Oh, please give me a hand, use your technology to map genes."
Yes.
And I said, well, why would anybody want to map kangaroo genes?
Right.
But what he said was, well, Jenny, kangaroos are an independent experiment in mammalian evolution. And I thought, oh, wow. And so I really went to town on kangaroos and mapped genes on their sex chromosomes and figured out that they, we found that, yes, there is an SRY gene on the Y chromosome, just like there is in humans.
So they have an X and Y chromosome?
Yep, it's actually interesting because it's not as big as humans, and it turns out that about a third of our X and Y chromosomes were actually not X and Y chromosomes at all 150 million years ago when we had shared a common ancestor with the kangaroos. That came off a bit of another chromosome, got stuck onto the X and Y, and most of the human Y chromosome is that extra bit.
How do we ascertain that?
Well, because it's not there on the Y chromosome or the X chromosome in kangaroos, and we know that it was actually a bit of another chromosome, chromosome 5, that got stuck on about 100 million years ago.
How do we know it was that amount of time?
Well, because it's there in elephants, which we shared a common ancestor with an elephant about 105 million years ago. So it had happened before that, but it happened after the split with kangaroos and other marsupials.
Right.
So it's somewhere between 105 and 148 million years ago that extra bit got stuck on our sex chromosomes and contribute most to our Y chromosome.
You do talks sort of about intelligent design, or to, I suppose, argue against intelligent design. And one of the examples we talked about briefly before was the spotted hyena.
Oh, well, for a long time I ran a website called Dumb Design.
Right.
Because there's so many things that you see in nature that just make no sense at all. And sex chromosomes are one of them. Sex chromosomes are a terrible idea.
Are they? Why?
Well, to begin with, having only one X chromosome is a really bad idea because there are lots of genes on it, particularly genes that are important in brain development. And if you've only got one of them, which males have, if there's a mutation in it, bad luck.
It's the good chromosome as well, isn't it? Because the Y is unstable,
Well,
essentially.
there's almost nothing left on the Y chromosome. There's only 45 genes. 27 of those are on the male-specific region. The others actually shared with the X. So there's 27 genes on the Y, and there's more than 1,000 on the X.
Right.
So most of those genes have gone, and that includes some really important genes. So if you've got a mutation in those genes, that's bad luck. You're mentally affected.
This was in terms of conditions, maybe developmental conditions and disease. It's more likely to occur for males?
Well, it'll occur in males because there is only one copy of the X chromosome.
Yeah, 'cause
in
there's
females, there's a backup copy. And, of course, I've talked about mental retardation, but there are lots of other genes, like, for instance, blood clotting factors. If you have a blood clotting factor and there's a gene on the X chromosome, if there's something wrong with that gene, you have haemophilia. So most haemophiliacs are men, because they don't have a backup. Women can be heterozygous, so they have one good copy, one bad copy, but they're fine.
So I always got the sense from reading this, and I certainly don't know much about it, but I got the sense that men are always more vulnerable.
Oh, yeah.
Like from in utero, so more likely to miscarriage
And a
and
lot of
things
that
like that.
may well be because they have only one X chromosome. So if you look at mental institutions, most of the patients with mental retardation are boys. And that's because the X chromosome has an awful lot of genes on it that is required for building a brain. And if there's anything wrong with any of those genes, you have some serious mental problems. Same with colour blindness. I mean, that's not such a problem, but mostly it's boys who are colour blind because there's a gene on the X chromosome.
So males are overrepresented in terms of genius IQ as well. Is that more socially constructed, or is there
I
some
think
genetic?
there is some evidence for that, and that is what you'd expect because the frequency, the bell curve is the same, but it'll be wider for males because there's more fluctuation because there's only one X chromosome.
So more
Females are
extremes.
kind of the average of their two X chromosomes, but poor old males have only got one.
I suppose in terms of dumb design, we were going to talk about the spotted hyena.
Well, the spotted hyena is a lovely example because the females are extremely aggressive, but they have male genitalia. I mean, they have a penis and they give birth through the penis,
Yes.
which is an extremely hairy, painful experience that usually the firstborn does not survive. So it seems like a really silly idea. But in fact, what's happened is that there's been selection for very aggressive females that can defend their territory and defend their young. And what that has led to has been selection for high testosterone levels. And the side effect of that high testosterone is to make male phallus.
The females are larger, stronger. The lowest female on the hierarchy of females is higher than the highest male on
That's
their
right, they
hierarchy.
keep their males in order. Yes, so it seems like a really bad way to have babies, but you can see
why. Why? This seems like a mistake.
Well, there's a lot of things in nature that seem like mistakes, and you can always find explanations, not in function, but in evolution. This happened because there was selection for very aggressive females that can defend their patch and basically have more babies.
Why with hyenas? Why with spotted hyenas and not striped hyenas? Or why not with chimpanzees and gorillas?
That's a question for the ecologists.
Right.
You're listening to Deep Trouble. Dr. Mark Halloran in conversation with Jenny Graves, Professor of Genetics.
Coming back to it, you gave another example earlier when we spoke about species where males are redundant and environmental cues can essentially turn a female into a male when needed.
I wouldn't say the males are redundant, but there's a lot of fish that change sex. And I've always been very intrigued by those because I'm a sex chromosome person. And some of these fish don't have sex chromosomes at all. Some fish start off being female and then turn into males when they get to a particular size. Others start off as males and turn into females when they get to a particular size. The one that I'm most interested in, and I'm doing some work with an ex-student of mine in New Zealand, is a fish called the blue wrasse, where there's a single male and he's got a blue head, and everybody else is female. They're smaller and they're yellow. But if you take that male out, the biggest female becomes male. She becomes male very quickly. Her behaviour changes in minutes.
Yes.
Her colour starts to change in hours. And within 9 or 10 days, she's given away her ovary and she has a testis making sperm, which is absolutely a remarkable reprogramming.
That is a very flexible reprogramming. I mean, are any males born, or is that generally just how it happens?
No, it's generally how it happens. And the group that I'm working with in New Zealand has looked at what genes are expressed and finds that during this transition from female to male, that the first thing that happens is that the female genes are downregulated very, very quickly.
Yes.
Stress genes are upregulated, reprogramming genes are upregulated, and then the male genes are all upregulated. So it all happens in a week.
So you said that stress hormones like cortisol are really important in terms of this type of sex differentiation and selection.
Well, I also work with a group at the University of Canberra who work on the dragon lizard. And that was interesting because we thought we were looking at sex chromosomes as sex genes, and there are sex chromosomes, which we discovered, and sex gene, we think we know what that is. But if you incubate the eggs at a higher temperature, everybody's a girl. And some of them have male sex chromosomes, but they're actually born female. They behave like females. They lay eggs like females. In fact, they lay more eggs than ordinary females. So there's obviously a switch that happens at high temperature that overrules the sex-determining gene. And so that gave us an opportunity to look at, well, what genes are being expressed. And what we found was very interesting. First, stress genes were being way overexpressed in these sex-reversed females. So they had very high stress genes, and then we could find there were very specific differences in epigenetic markers. So some of the genes that changed the epigenetic marks were changed so that they wouldn't work.
Yes.
So somehow that releases something else in the pathway, so instead of getting males, you get females.
I got the sense before, I've never read it, but Richard Dawkins' book, The Extended Phenotype, when you're talking about the fish and the female, the male, the one that is currently the male, for some reason being taken out of the mix, and then within a very, very short period of time, minutes or something, this female then adapting to the environment, presumably the environment containing other females, to become male. So upregulation of stress hormones and
that's exactly the blue RAS experience.
So it seems as though that the environment's signalling all the time in different ways.
The interesting thing is that the signal is visual.
Right.
So they've done an experiments long ago to show that if you put, a female on one side of a barrier in an aquarium through which water can't get, if you put a bigger female on the other side, she'll stay female. If you put a smaller female, she'll become male.
Right.
If you put a mirror in there, she'll go crazy.
Right.
Because she won't be able to judge. So who knows how she judges that she's the biggest female in the tank? There must be some sort of visual measuring apparatus that we don't understand.
I mean, that's fascinating though, isn't it?
Absolutely.
That at a biological level, the decision to differentiate and become male becomes not just on the presence of another female and the absence of a male, but the actual size of the female.
Absolutely.
And there's a really fine judgment around it.
Judgment
in that if it's
and
large,
stress.
that's fine, and stress, and then small. But then because when you put a mirror, you're exactly the same size, they become distressed because they can't get the differentiation.
No, that's right.
That's really interesting.
Yes, I love those experiments.
Yeah. It's off the topic, but it reminds me of Pavlov's dogs, which the classical conditioning thing to me wasn't the most interesting thing. What he did was he trained the dogs to recognise circles and ellipses, and then he only fed the dogs when they were presented with a circle. But then he created successive variations between a circle and an ellipse. And what happened was, when it got so close, the dog couldn't differentiate.
Am I going to get fed or am I not going
I'm
to
not
get
going to
fed?
get fed. The dogs developed a mental disorder which they could never recovered from.
I never
like
heard
post-traumatic stress.
Wow.
Yeah, I did psych.
Well, you're talking about the blue RAS and a mirror.
Yeah, and that's what the
PST and blue RAS.
Yeah, that's what the blue RAS reminded me of. I suppose we've been talking about gender, we've been talking about sexuality, and we did talk earlier about equality and equity. And what are your thoughts about that?
Oh, interesting. Talking about sex, I think nobody in their right mind would say that men and women were absolutely the same.
Right.
So if
there
you
are
think,
people that say that, though.
Well, there are, and I have met some of them.
How did that go?
Well, in my very early years at La Trobe, we had a new appointment who was going to have a women's studies program.
Within the humanities.
Yeah. And I thought, oh, terrific. And she was calling for volunteers to give a few lectures. So I wrote her a memo saying, yes, this is a great idea. I'd be happy to give 6 lectures on biological differences between men and women.
Yes.
And I never heard back. So I sent it another one and I never heard back. And I found out later there are no biological differences between men and women. So what do you think you're going to talk about?
They're socially constructed.
They're all socially constructed.
Yeah.
So that was a bit of a shock to me. But I don't think anybody would adhere to that anymore. Men and women are biologically very different. Right. It's not just the genes on the Y chromosome or the genes on the X chromosomes. It's 1/3 of the genome is expressed very differently in one tissue or another, or all of them. So they are not equal if you think of equal being biologically the same. Equity is something different. I mean, you want to give men and women the same opportunities. You want to give short people and tall people the same opportunities. So you can put a soapbox on the fence so the short people can look over it. You want to give disabled people the same opportunities. So you put in wheelchair ramps. I mean, equity to me means helping people achieve the same opportunities.
So there's an equal opportunity. Because people define equity in very different ways.
Oh, absolutely.
Nowadays.
That's the way I define it.
Some people define it the opposite of that, of like reducing some people's, the people who are perceived to be the most dominant, reducing their opportunities and extending the opportunities of people.
Well, that's kind of like cutting tall people off at the knees. I don't think anybody would go for that.
Well, it depends on the regime. So it was really important, and you've done a lot of work in terms of, I suppose, equality of opportunity for women in science. Yes,
I've had a lot of opportunities to have some input, both through the Academy of Science, and I'm really very pleased that the Academy's taken the lead in making opportunities for women and for encouraging institutions to up their game. I think that's actually working very well. After 40 years being on committees that never did anything except write more and more reports, it's all saying the same thing. It's just wonderful to see something actually happening on the ground.
So there's actual action.
Actual action is fantastic.
And the barriers for women in science.
Well, there still are barriers, and nobody can pretend that it's easy being a woman in science, particularly if you want to have kids. I'm often asked by young women, when's the best time to have a baby? And you have to say, dear, there is no good time to have a baby. Just have your baby and muddle along like the rest of us, because there's always ways you can do it if you really want to, but nobody's saying it's easy.
I guess because we talked about particularly now the funding structure and the opportunity for grants and the success of a NHMRC grant and ARC grants, somewhere around 10%. It used to be about 30%. So if you took time out for maternity leave, that might be the end of your career, essentially.
Unfortunately, that is the case, and what I'm hoping will come out of all of this is more opportunities for men to take time off and get to know their kids too. And I think that is happening, although more slowly than some of us would like. So I'd love to see pressure for the men. We want paternity leave too. We want to not just help out the missus, but we want an opportunity to be with our children and have a significant role in their upbringing.
Do they get any paternity leave?
In some institutions, yes.
Yeah. Because science is sometimes a 12-hour-a-day or 5 or 7 day a week venture.
I think that's another problem. I mean, it is, as you say, incredibly competitive, and that doesn't make it easy either for men or for women. I really feel extremely sorry for young people getting into science these days, because it's tough to make your mark, start up a new lab, so much administrative nonsense you've got to go through, as well as the things you're really hired for, which is teaching and research. It's a tough life, and you've got to really want to do it. It's a tough life, but incredibly rewarding life, but it's not easy.
I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for agreeing to be part of the series.
You're very welcome, Mark. It's been fun talking to you.
And so that was the interview with Mark Halloran and Professor Jenny Graves. Mark, how do you think that went?
I thought it was fascinating. I thought the idea around genetic determination in terms of sexuality and gender is a fascinating area. There's always an element to it that's socially constructed, but we've discounted the biological determinants of gender and sexuality, and now we're starting to uncover that.
By the way, you do mention DSD. So could you just explain, what does DSD mean again?
So DSD means disorders of sex development. So that's a medical term. In terms of the sociological term in the community, we talk about intersex people. So people whose physical outward expression, and also internal as well, because there'll be hormonal changes and changes to internal sex organs as well. So people with that ambiguity refer to themselves as a community as intersex. But she uses a medical term.
So next week, Mark, you're going to be introducing Chris Mulheron.
Yes, I am. Chris Mulheron is Dr. Reverend Chris Mulheron is the director of a Christian science organisation, ICAST, and he is also a philosopher who teaches the philosophy of science at Melbourne University. And recently, not that recently, but still relatively recently, he wrote an article for The Conversation about climate change and science and how we understand that.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Steve.
Deep Trouble is produced by Steve Charman in the studios of Main FM, Castle, Maine.
Trouble magazine would like to thank its sponsors: Ararat Gallery Tama, Bendigo Living Art Space, Fox Galleries Melbourne, Manningham Gallery, Swan Hill Regional Art Gallery, Wangaratta Art Gallery, and Western Sydney University. Thanks for your support.